Okay, so this is a walkthrough for practice test 3, the practice test for the third and final test. As before, there was a review sheet, and the major sections on the review sheet correspond to sections in the that will be on the test, right? So the first section is again on the characters, and so some of these are characters that are we've just been keeping track of all along. Deborah Lax, Gila, Henrietta Lax, Rebecca Skloot. I also have added two characters that we learn. One we learn is just introduced to us overall, Ted Slavin, and another whom we learn a lot more about because he gets his own chapter, and that's Zakaria Rahman, who was born Joe Lax. So if you look, let's just start on the practice test and look at the first two questions here. So, sample question that you might get asked: how did the Lax family learn about the existence of Gila? So the correct answer here is that in 1973, Babette Lax met a friend's relative who worked with Gila cells at the National Cancer Institute. As the conversation went on, they were able to figure out that the Gila cells came from Babette's mother-in-law. So all of that happens in the chapter here, chapter 23. It's Alive, which is the one that we read for week 11. We read It's Alive in the next chapter. And we talked in that section about medical communication, because there was everything that's going on in that chapter is about miscommunications between the researchers and the Lax family, and it's all just crazy. So that was that. That's the kind of thing that you should have notes on and you should be able to do. Okay, Ted Slavin. So Ted Slavin is one of the characters we meet when we are talking about different cases that are similar to Lax's case or otherwise were important for the history of the people's ownerships over their bodily tissues. So we meet Slavin here on page 202. This is in the chapter Who Told You You Could Sell My Spleen? The chapter actually focuses on the story of John Moore, whose spleen, cancer cells from his spleen were used to create a cell line without his permission. But unlike the case of Henrietta Lax, this one, he actually found out about this, and there was a lawsuit about it. Ted Slavin's case is the third in this kind of series, and what makes Slavin different is that for once, the doctors were completely honest with him, right? So George and Margaret Guy were not honest with Henrietta Lax. John Moore's doctor was not, Daniel Gold was not honest with him. But with Slavin, he was simply told. He had developed antibodies to hepatitis B, so the answer here is the first one. And his doctor said, yeah, actually, your body, just because of some coincidence for who you are, some coincidence of biology, it turns out your body is valuable, and you can profit from it, right? Rather than what other doctors would have done, which is found a way for them to profit off their patients' bodies. All right, so those are two sample questions from the first section on characters. The next section in the review sheet is on philosophical concepts. And actually, we're only dealing with two source readings here. One is Jung's Five Faces of Oppression, and the other is the medical versus the social model of disability, which was discussed in the reading by Tom Shakespeare. So you're going to get one question from each of these. And often the question is just going to be, identify one of the faces of oppression. So in this case, for number 3, the practice test, I believe, is drawing randomly. I don't just believe, I know. The practice test is drawing randomly from the same pool that the actual test will draw from. So in this case, it will, unlike other questions in the practice test, this will this will change randomly with each one. But it's all going to be things like this, identify the 5 faces of oppression. And it's just good to have these in your mind because I find it's a really powerful way to think about the different kinds of oppression, and rather than just saying, oh, well, there is racism and then there's sexism and, there's ableism, or there's different ways that there are different groups that are marginalized. Rather than thinking about the oppressed group and its history, think about the mechanisms which can be applied to any group. For instance, cultural imperialism is the term that Jung gives for the situation where the dominant meanings of a society are constructed around one group, and then another group is portrayed, and this is often just about media portrayals, portrayed as marginalized or other. So when you call this one up, the perspective of the experience of the dominant meanings of society that render the perspectives of one's own group invisible or stereotyping it as other, right? So when your default family on TV, which it was forever, was white, and then the image of black families where black culture is either completely erased or stereotyped. Exploitation. This is an important one, which and Jung defines exploitation always in terms of groups. Her political philosophy is about the relationship between social groups like races or genders or other socially constructed groups. And so exploitation actually has its home as a Marxist concept, right? The exploitation of the working class by the owning class. But Jung wants to generalize it. So, for instance, you can talk about the exploitation of women when unpaid labor in the household is dumped on them. So what she defines it as exploitation as is the steady transfer of the results of labor from one group to another. So basically, some group labors and another group profits. And so you can see how this is rooted in the idea, the Marxist notion of exploitation. That is, you work in the factory and your boss gets all the money, but it can be expanded to larger other circumstances. Marginalization is the fate of those groups that the system cannot or will not use. And so we see Zakaria as a marginalized individual in this story because he is unable to get work after he gets out of jail. So, people who work, people who are used by the system can often be exploited. And then people who are not used by the system are just left out. You see they have experiences like Zakaria's of homelessness, for instance. Powerlessness refers to your lack of autonomy. It's mostly thought about in terms of the workplace. So some workers have control over their workplace. They decide how they're going to do their job, what their job is, and other people just go to work and do as they're told. And that's a form of oppression, to have a large portion of your life not under your control, not something that we're not a place where you can exercise autonomy. And then violence is not just any form of physical harm, but physical harm that's directed at members of a group because they are members of a group. And again, all of these forms of oppression are defined in terms of relationships between groups. And one of the things that Jung emphasizes with violence as a form of oppression is that it generally works actually more by terror than by direct physical harm. So you think about a regime like lynching. A small number of individuals were lynched horrifically, and then an even larger number of individuals live in terror because of the drama of the and the horrificness of these lynching effects. So the effects go beyond the individuals to, in fact, render a whole community, to disempower a whole community. And so, in that sense, lynching was like terrorism, like suicide terrorism, in that its purpose wasn't just to kill individuals, but to create a climate of fear. All right. The other one in this section is on the social model of disability versus the medical model of disability. And so this was in the reading by Tom Shakespeare that we read in conjunction with the section on Elsie Lax at the Crownsville Hospital, right? Elsie Lax was born with severe developmental disabilities, was never learned to talk, and was taken to a mental hospital where she was subjected to experiments. And so we took this opportunity to learn a little bit about the disability rights movement. And Shakespeare has a summary of this, where he talks about the difference between thinking about disability as a medical condition and thinking about it as a social condition. And the idea is everyone has a certain set of abilities, right? There are things you can do or you can't do. You can walk, you can't walk. You can do calculus, you can't do calculus. And society then is built to handle some of these people and not others. So the key idea here is that disabled people are an oppressed group, like similar to racial or ethnic minorities. So number one on this is checked. Number two is not, right? The number two is the direct negation of number one, and that's not what we're going to say. I'm going to skip number three for a second. I'm going to talk about the last two, and the order is actually randomized, so they'll appear in a different order on your test. But these are the three correct answers. So one of the things the social model does is distinguish disability from impairment. An impairment might be a specific medical problem an individual might have. For instance, they may be paralyzed from the waist down. But whether or not that impairment amounts to a disability depends on how society is structured, right? And one of the things that actually Shakespeare emphasizes is that the early disability rights movement was led by men who used wheelchairs, and so that became a kind of a focal point for a form of organizing and an understanding of what accessibility means. So they were looking for wheelchair accessible buildings. So whether or not you can move your legs is an impairment, whether or not you can get into a courthouse is a disability. The disability is society's problem, not the individual's problem. So the last item, society is what disables people. Disability is a mismatch between the structure of society and an individual's ability. The more typical way of thinking about disability would be the medical model, where a disability is an individual medical problem and the solution is to change the individual. But if disability is a mismatch between the individual and the structure of society, rather than changing the individual, you can change the structure of society. So a guy can't get into the courthouse because he uses a wheelchair. Well, one approach is to try to cure his medical condition, and that might have some success or it might not. Another approach is to change society and make the courthouse wheelchair accessible. All right. The next two questions on the review sheet are taken from this section about terms and argument, and these have been the same throughout throughout the course. They haven't changed from review sheet to review sheet. And as with previous tests, I'm going to have one question where you put an argument in standard form, and one question where you have to explain one of these concepts. And again, both of these on the review sheet, the review test itself, are pulling randomly from the same pool of questions that the real test will pull from. But the pool that I'm using here, the pools, are actually general pools that I'm creating that will be used, that I can use in all my courses. So these will not be bioethics specific questions, nor will they be specific to The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. They're just about argument in general, because this is a topic that I teach in all of my courses, and I just want to continually reinforce at every turn I want to talk about this. So in this case, actually, the passage that you get for the standard form question is a bioethics passage, but that just turns out to be, that's just chance. So let's look at this passage. Doctors should not have to ask permission to sell tissues they remove from your body as a part of your treatment. We all benefit from the advancements that society makes through research on these tissues, and the burden of keeping track of where every tissue sample comes from and what you can use it for would be too great. So this passage, you notice it does not have any indicator words in it. It doesn't say because or therefore at any point, or any synonym for those. Nevertheless, you can tell that this first sentence is a conclusion. This is the thing that the speaker is trying to convince you of, and the other two passages, the other two sentences are statements that provide evidence for the first statement. So what we can do here is, we'll just go down here, put this in standard form. The first sentence is the conclusion. I didn't want that in italics. It's not unitalicizing. That's annoying. Okay, but maybe we'll just have to live with it in italics. The first sentence from the passage is the conclusion. The other two passages that are premises or sentences, we'll mark them P1 and P2. We all benefit from these treatments, and so I could cut and paste here. It's also acceptable to paraphrase. If you were writing this on a paper test, I would expect people to paraphrase, since you can't cut and paste even within the test. But you could also just say, we all benefit from this research, from this science. And then two, the burden of keeping track would be too great. The burden of tracking the origin of the tissue samples would be too great. And this is actually an argument that we saw people making. We see people making in the end of the book when Skloot comes around to talk about the fundamental issues here. And then when we put things in standard form, we draw a line until we get, and then get to the conclusion. And we also want to talk about indicator words. In this case, we say there are no indicator words or phrases. All right. The next one is a sorting question. And in this case, what you're sorting is statements that are normative and statements that are descriptive. When we talk about reasoning, one of the basic things that we do is we talk about statements or assertions, propositions, claims, right? These are things that can be true or false. But not all statements are the same. Sometimes we make a statement and it's about the world. We call this a descriptive statement. It's about the way the world is or is not. Sometimes we make statements not about the way the world is, but the way the world should be. Those are called normative statements. So the basic difference between descriptive and normative statements is some are is statements and some are should statements. And this means this is part of how the idea of a statement cuts across what you may have been taught in the past about fact and opinion. Because sometimes people will just say normative statements are just your opinion. But they're all statements and they could be true or false. All right, so let me just pull some examples here. George W. Bush is the king of Jupiter. This is a descriptive statement. It's false, it's silly, but if it were true, it would be about the way the world is, right? It's a false claim about the way the world is. We can compare it to this statement here. You are sitting down right now. This, when you apply it to me, is a true statement about the way the world is. I am sitting down right now. But you also have should statements. They go in the other category. You should always keep your promises is an explicit should statement, right? It's got the should right there. Sometimes shoulds are hidden. If I say animal abuse is morally abhorrent, there's an implicit should there because I'm saying you shouldn't abuse animals, right? Torturing babies for fun is wrong. This is a true moral statement. And sometimes in philosophy, people will argue that moral statements aren't really true or false. And I generally trot this one out as just a simple example of a true moral statement, right? Yeah. Okay. You shouldn't swim right after eating. It's another should statement. Jupiter should not have a monarchy. This is a should statement. It's just as silly as saying George Bush is the king of Jupiter, but it's got a should in it. Ocean currents are the slowest they've been in 1,000 years. This is a true descriptive statement. I remember reading about it, and I forget why ocean currents are slower now. Maybe it has something to do with global warming, but in any case, there it is. And it doesn't matter. You don't need to know whether it's true. You just need to know that it's the sort of thing that would be true of the way the world is. Recreational marijuana is illegal in Ohio. I think that is still a true statement. You would contrast it with the normative statement, recreational marijuana should be legal or should be illegal. We'll leave that aside. A vast civilization of superintelligent aliens lives in caves on the moon. That is another silly, false, descriptive statement. All right. Questions 7 and 8 are in the category history of bioethics. So they are about things that are, sort of important for just the history of bioethics. So one question here is actually about the Crownsville State Mental Hospital. And in this case, it's specific to what happened to Elsie Lax. So I guess I could have classified it as a character question. But Crownsville and what happened there, I'm counting as history. So what happened there? Lots of ugly things happened there. But among other things, Elsie Lax's skull was drained of its cerebral spinal fluid so that they could take clear X-ray pictures of her brain. And this would have caused headaches and seizures until such time as her body replenished the brain fluid. And it was a painful experiment done on someone who could not consent, and not done for the benefit of the patient. It was just done for pure science. We want to see what a brain looks like. Diamond versus Chakrabarty is an extremely important ruling in the history of genetic ethics, because this is the ruling that said you can patent a life form. So Chakrabarty, this was a where is it? The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a patent could be issued for a genetically modified living organism. Chakrabarty took 4 bacteria that weren't particularly good at eating oil and combined them together to create a super duper oil-eating bacterium. And to this day, variants on this bacterium are used to clean up oil spills. When there was that big oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico from the BP oil rig, they brought in updated versions of these same genetically modified organisms. And because you are taking matter and creating a new arrangement of it that has a useful purpose, it's thought of as a something you can patent. But this means that you can start patenting genes, and that has dramatically affected the history of bioethics ever since. In particular, there are now patents for human genes. So a single company, Myriad Genetics, owns the patents for the variants of the genes BRCA1 and BRCA2, which increase your likelihood of having breast cancer if you've got it in your family. And what are they able to do with these patents? They're able to up the price on genetic tests to see whether or not you are susceptible to these kinds of cancers. They're able to control the market. All right, the next 2 questions are about arguments. So I'm looking for reasons that are given by different authors for different positions. Number 9 goes back to Moore versus Regents. Remember, Moore was the guy in the chapter, Who Told You You Could Sell My Spleen? And in Moore versus Regents, the California State Supreme Court ruled that you can. Moore's doctor, Dr. Gold, could sell his spleen because he left it. And the idea is that whenever you leave behind tissue at a doctor's office, it becomes the property of the doctor. And so what were the reasons here? Well, one is just that this is like the court said this is like leaving garbage on a curb. But they also thought that if we allowed patients rights to their tissues, then it would stifle research, because doctors would have to pay people whose bodies happen to have valuable properties, and doctors insisted that if they had to do this, they wouldn't be able to afford to do their research. Now, one of the things we've seen repeatedly in this book is that medical researchers routinely say we need to be able to profit from this completely, otherwise it'll stifle research. And often it turns out that that's just not the case, right? So we saw, for instance, with protections for experimental subjects, doctors said, well, if you pass these rules, we won't be able to research. But research in fact, goes on. All right. So we also read an essay by Annis criticizing this ruling. And one of the things that Anna says is that the Supreme Court was just spellbound by the science and didn't really think about the actual, the relevant rights. All right. So the last essay we read is by Jonlin, and it is about this interesting new fact, which is now we are all Henrietta Lacks. So Henrietta Lacks's tissues lived forever because they were taken from a cancer, a cancerous tumor that was incredibly powerful. Incredibly invasive, spread really, really fast. These days, with stem cells, we now have the capacity to turn any cell whatsoever into an immortal stem cell line, which means that we all have the potential to be someone like Henrietta Lacks. Anything we leave behind now can, you get a tooth pulled. And that tooth now belongs to your dentist, but it could also be used to create a cell line. It doesn't have to be something extraordinary like Henrietta Lacks's cervical tumor. All right. So Jonlin gives some recommendations about donor consent here. And so let's just run through these. So what are Jonlin's recommendations in this situation? She says, if you go back, you can just look at the reading itself, right? She talks about how you need to respect confidentiality of records. Patients need to know how the cells are going to be extracted, but she does not actually say that patients should get ownership rights to the tissue samples. There she actually falls back on existing arguments. The way this one was randomized, it's 1, 3, and 5. Notice that statement 2 isn't even a recommendation. It's just a fact about pluripotent stem cells. They are ordinary cells that have been immortalized and transformed into stem cells. So you can tell right away that that one isn't a recommendation. It's not even in the right form to be a recommendation. The other 3 are correct recommendations, and then the idea that you should profit from it is not a recommendation. So that is it. And if you have any questions, just let me know. And good luck on the test.